Good morning. So, today we're going to be talking about the essential question: how were colonial governments set up and were they successful? So, there's actually two parts to that essential question. So, the first one we're going to talk about is the Magna Carta. Now, in your assignment, you do need to make sure that you have this chart written down. Okay, I gave you a little picture of it in the assignment. So, in 1215, which is right around the time of the ending of the Crusades, King John, who was king of England, agreed to the terms of the Magna Carta after an uprising for his rebel barons. Now, a baron is just a member of the lowest order of the British nobility. So essentially, a baron is just a man who pledges loyalty and service to his king or queen in return for land. Because if you remember, if you have land, that means that you're pretty wealthy. And he wanted this land to be able to pass it down to his heirs. So the barons were upset over the war that King John had with France and King Philip II, and that was around 1200 AD. It lasted several years. And then in this war, King John lost almost all of his belongings that the British had in France. So the barons were upset at that because they believe after the death of King Richard, because King Richard has chosen his own successor, which was Arthur. um, Unfortunately, King John did not recognize that because Arthur was only 3 years old at the time. And so, because of this, King John refused to recognize him, and the barons got upset. So, because of this uprising of the rebel barons, King John ended up signing the Magna Carta. Originally, it had 63 clauses, and some of those clauses documented the liberties of free men, such as the liberties and rights of the church. English subjects had the right to a fair and just trial, and that free men cannot be imprisoned without that just trial. Unfortunately, its short term goal was unsuccessful. King John refused to follow it. He actually wrote to the Pope of the Catholic Church and asked the Pope to review the clauses. The Pope said it was null and void forever. War broke out between the barons and King John, and unfortunately, King John was killed. And then in 1225, King Henry III was presented with a different version of it. So its short term goal was unsuccessful. However, its long term goal was successful because some of these ideas ended up in the American Bill of Rights. So, what we're going to do right now is we're actually going to write down what belongs in the Magna Carta. Okay? So, going back to our essential question, how were these governments set up? So, I'm going to write the how right here. It was set up when King John signed it after rebel uprising. Now, it did document men's liberties. And there again, it was unsuccessful short term, but it was successful long term. And I'm going to write American Bill of Rights down here because we're going to see a lot of these ideas that were in the Magna Carta are going to be found in the American Bill of Rights. Okay? So our next one is the House of Burgesses in 1619. So the House of Burgesses was formed when Governor Yeardley arrived in Virginia from England and announced that the Virginia Company had voted to abolish martial law and create a legislative assembly. This legislative assembly became known as the General Assembly, which later became known as the House of Burgesses. Now, this General Assembly was the first legislative assembly in the American colonies. It's very important that you note that. The General Assembly first met on July 30th, 1619, in a church at Jamestown. If you remember, Jamestown was the first permanent settlement. And then 22 burgesses that represented 11 different plantations. And those plantations were also known as settlements. So these burgesses were actually elected representatives. That means that people went to their county seat, they elected them, and then those 22 men, along with Governor Yardley, are the ones who formed that council. So in 1643, the General Assembly actually became known as the House of Burgesses, but they're the same thing. So the House of Burgesses is the same thing as General Assembly, is the same thing as a colonial assembly. So there again, I might use those interchangeably. Unfortunately, only white men who owned a specific amount of property were eligible to vote for the burgesses. So even if you did own land, if you didn't own enough land, you weren't allowed to vote. The House of Burgesses became the first elected lawmaking body. Because property owners were allowed to vote on the burgesses, it also led to the first representative government elected by its people, and they weren't just appointed by the king or the queen. Okay, King James I didn't like this, so he tried to get it dissolved, but it was extremely unsuccessful. The colonists refused to abide by his wishes, and so they went about continuing their meetings, continuing their government. And afterwards, it was very successful because the other colonies wanted to structure their government in that similar way. So for the how was it established? The Virginia Company. The Virginia Company abolished martial law. Okay. And this abolishment of martial law then created the first legislative body. And it was very successful. Okay, there again, we're going to see that other colonies wanted to form their governments after that. And there again, it was the first elected lawmaking body. Okay, so it was very successful. Sorry, you all know I like to kind of get myself organized. So our next one is the Mayflower Compact. So the Mayflower Compact was in 1620, and the Mayflower Compact was the Pilgrims seeking the right to worship the way they wished. The Pilgrims had signed a contract with the Virginia Company because those of you that came to small group, hopefully you remember that the Mayflower was supposed to land over in Virginia, but it got blown off course, and so it ended up landing in Massachusetts. So originally they were supposed to have this contract with the Virginia Company to settle in Virginia. The Virginia Company was a trading company chartered by King James I, and his goal was to colonize parts of the eastern coast of the New World. Of those 102 passengers that were actually on the Mayflower, there were 50 men, 19 women, and then 33 young adults and children. Only 41 of those were considered true pilgrims. So those pilgrims are the religious separatists that are seeking freedom from the Church of England. The others were considered common folk. It included merchants, craftsmen, indentured servants, orphan children, and the Pilgrims ended up calling them strangers. When the Mayflower landed in Massachusetts instead of Virginia, they discussed, before they even left the ship, what were they going to do. because the strangers argued that since they were no longer under the command of the Virginia Company, that they could do whatever they wanted to. They felt since the Mayflower landed outside of that territory that they were no longer forced to comply by those rules. So the defiant strangers refused to recognize any rules, and it was going to be very chaotic. So the Pilgrims knew that if something wasn't done quickly, it could be very chaotic for themselves, for their wives, for their family. So while they were on the boat, they drafted a set of laws, which included remaining loyal to the king, creating and enacting laws for the good of the colony, and then, of course, live in accordance with the Christian faith. The document is considered to be successful because it was the first document that established self-government, and it played a role in seeking independence from Britain later on during the Revolutionary War. So, in order to fill out this Mayflower Compact, the how. So, it was set up by the Pilgrims. There again, remember, Pilgrims are going to be those religious separatists. And it was established by the Pilgrims to establish the rules of Plymouth. And only 41 of the 102 allowed to sign it. And it was the first document to establish self-government. Whoa. And it was successful. All right, our final government of the 13 colonies are going to be our proprietary and our royal colonies. Proprietary colonies were actually grants of land in the form of a charter for an individual or their family. It was given to them by the king or queen, but it was in hopes that these people would swiftly go to the colonies and form these settlements. The proprietors could appoint the officials, they could create courts, they could hear appeals, they could pardon offenders, they could make laws, they could do all kinds of different things. They actually had the opportunity to recoup their investment by collecting annual land fees. And with these land fees, it came from the settlers who had purchased land within these colonies. So proprietary is ruled by a male. Okay, there again, women, indentured servants, enslaved Africans could not have a proprietary area. And they are going to make their own laws. Okay. So that's the how for the proprietary. And then for the royal colony, that is going to be ruled by an official that's appointed by the king. So the official actually has to do what the king tells him to do when he is governing this area. Within this royal colony, they are going to have a representative assembly that was elected by the people. Okay. Now, think about this. They're ruled by a male, they make their own laws. This is not going to be very successful because eventually the proprietors who are in the same area begin arguing. So, I'm going to put unsuccessful. And then, of course, the royal is going to be successful. Okay. If you have any questions, please let me know. I hope y'all have a good day.